He's a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Yale University. His entrepreneurial experience is impressive. The third company which he was president of and co-founder was the Zapata Offshore Company, known to most of you for its enormous success in offshore drilling. In public life, he served 4 years in the Congress of the United States as American Ambassador to the United Nations, Republican National Committee Chairman, Chief of the Liaison Office of the United States to the People's Republic of China, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, before becoming Vice President of the United States. As you all know, the Vice President has had a busy last 7 days or so. He's been to 3 countries in Africa, to Switzerland, looked in at the arms negotiation talks, has been to Moscow, Brazil, 2 countries in Central America, and is capping that all off by coming to Baltimore. Mr. Brad Jacobs has, in previous introductions, talked about timing. Not only is there a real preface to today's remarks because of the recent trip, but also we're looking forward to some very important congressional action with respect to the national security policy of the United States. And so we're indeed privileged and honored to host the Vice President as he delivers his remarks on national security policy of the United States. It is with the greatest of pleasure that I introduce the Vice President of the United States, the Honorable George Bush.
Maybe I should.
Okay. Thank you. Barbara, nice to be here. Thank you all.
I'll moderate them from the side of the platform.
All right. Well, Frank, thank you very much. Thank you all for this warm hospitality and this opportunity. My respects to the members of the House of Representatives who are here. They do have some male members of the House of Representatives, but Maryland is doing its thing with the leadership we see up here, and we're very proud of that. As to my friend Senator Mac Mathias, why, perhaps my judgment is beclouded by friendship, but he is certainly one of the most outstanding senators we have there in Washington and perhaps have ever had. So I'm delighted to be here with him. And it is nice to be here in Baltimore. I was going to say Mali, but it's Baltimore, I can tell. And I figure that although I'm about 3 countries behind in jet lag, I will try to make some sense on what I feel is a very important issue. But about 2 weeks ago, and it is funny how time flies, but exactly 2 weeks ago, last night, we left for our trip really to go mainly to the drought-stricken areas, the Sahel in Africa, 3 countries, and then on to Geneva to the UN Donors Conference, which incidentally worked out very well, thank heavens. And it was during that trip, of course, that I learned of Mr. Chernenko's death, and so I flew from Geneva via Rhine-Main into Moscow, meeting George Shultz there. I got this message, as I say, in Geneva. I'm not sure there's any connection, but this is the 3rd time that a Soviet leader has passed away while I've been visiting either Africa or Europe. And the moral of the story, when the United States Vice President is traveling abroad, consult your physician. Seriously, I've seen so much in the last 2 weeks, and it really was moving, the starving people. Particularly, I guess it had an impact on me and on my Barbara, the children. Starving people of Africa, and then really what was a very positive and hopeful response in Geneva. Then the funeral in Moscow and making the first contact for the United States government with the new General Secretary of the party, Mr. Gorbachev, and then an inspiring visit to Grenada, and then an extremely hopeful return to democracy in Brazil. He's entitled to my view, and I'll give you his view, and I'll give you the other side of that, because the United States went to Geneva and said, we will match half, we'll put up half, and the rest of the world put up the other half of the 3 million tons of food required to keep these kids from starving in Africa. That's what our country has done, and that's, I think, very good. And then again, I got a chance to visit after Brazil, seeing democracy take another step forward, chance to visit President Suazo in his small town there of La Paz in Honduras, 16,000 people, and then underline once again our commitment to the security of Honduras, to the freedom and democracy in Central America and throughout the Western Hemisphere. So after as I say, the great trend in Africa and in South America in the last 4 years, 11 countries going the democratic route with elections. But anyway, what I'd like to talk about today well, she feels strongly about that, and so do I, but I would like to get around to talking about this in a minute. But last week, what I want to talk to you today about is this whole question before the Congress of the MX. And last week, as I left Geneva for Moscow, I went by, we'd met the night before with our senators and the negotiators, but I went on the airport and passed this enormous accumulation of television cameras and news media from all around the world. And a few minutes later, the American negotiators sat down with their Soviet counterparts and began the most important arms talks in which our nation is likely to participate for the rest of this decade. Those talks cover under one umbrella not only the vast arsenals of intercontinental strategic weapons, which we've been struggling to limit and reduce for decades, but also the intermediate range nuclear weapons and defensive weapons. And later this week, and this is really what I want to talk about, and then I'll be glad to respond to questions on any subjects relating to this trip, any area or anything else having to do with our foreign policy. But later this week, Congress will vote on the release of the funds for the continued production of the MX. And I'd like to discuss for a moment why these votes are so very important, why they will bear directly on the outcome of the talks in Geneva, and indeed, in my view, on the prospects for a stable and enduring peace. First, it's important to understand why we believe the Soviets may at last be ready to engage in serious negotiations. Throughout much of the late 70s, as the men in the Kremlin cast their gaze upon us, they saw an economy that was growing stagnant. They heard talk of a national malaise, and they watched our defenses grow weaker. And to the Soviets, it must have seemed that the checks on the advance of their totalitarianism power were crumbling. The United States, once proud and once vigorous in this field, seemed more self-effacing. And the Soviets had little incentive to significantly reduce their near monopoly of heavily accurate ICBMs and their actual total monopoly on these INF, on these intermediate nuclear missiles. Today there is a different picture, and the Soviets see an America restored, once again strong, prosperous, a certain self-confidence, and devoted to the cause of human freedom. In this, our economy plays a vital part. The economic expansion that's now taking place is the most powerful and sustained in more than 3 decades. And during the past 27 months alone, America has created more jobs than have all the nations of Western Europe, let alone the Eastern Bloc, in the past 10 years. Now, our economy is being driven by incentives to new heights of progress. We're leading a high-tech revolution, a revolution that almost every day brings us new advanced technological breakthroughs, tremendous feats of imagination and entrepreneurship that the Soviets' state-managed economy can never hope to equal. If the 70s allowed the Soviets to believe for a time that the tide of history was actually with them, the early 80s have shown them how decidedly that is not, in fact, the case. Our economic growth alone would never have persuaded the Soviets, however, to return to the bargaining table if it hadn't been coupled with a determination to update our national defenses. In 1981, the President announced our strategic modernization program. It was designed to redress the strategic imbalance, not to seek superiority, as I'm afraid the Soviets still feel, but to redress the strategic imbalance that had been created during the late 70s, when our defense efforts went slack, while the Soviets during that period embarked on the biggest military buildup in the history of mankind. The strategic modernization program is proving successful, and the Soviets know it. And our strategic communications are being improved, and this is very important. The production of our new B-1B bombers and development of the stealth are on track. The new submarines, the sleek Tridents, are on patrol. In each of these new systems, the communications, the bombers, the submarines, and the submarine missiles is replacing an aging system, one that's some of which are about 25 years old. Despite these advances in the air and on the sea, there remains one important gap, and that is on these massive strategic missiles, our strategic forces on the land. Today, you see, those land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, or those ICBMs, are technologically out of date, older in many cases than the Air Force men and women who attend them. For 4 administrations, both Republican and Democrat, have proposed replacing some of those aging missiles with the MX, but political controversy has held up the development and the deployment of MX for years. Now, while we debated, let's be very clear what was happening. The Soviets deployed. Indeed, the number of MX caliber missiles that they have already in place is now higher than 600. During 82 alone, to quote General Vesey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Soviets produced more MX caliber warheads than are planned to be deployed over the entire MX program. Deployment of the MX at this point, in our view, represents a simple, fundamental necessity. Our proposal calls for the development of 100 MX missiles. It was the recommendation of the bipartisan Scowcroft Commission, a commission made up of the finest strategic thinkers in this country. It has the support of members of the Congress on both sides of the aisle. As a prominent Democrat said, Harold Brown, former Defense Secretary, the MX is very important to arms control negotiations. Having the MX production line open provides leverage with the Soviets. In other words, because the Soviets now completely overwhelm us in this newer, more potent class weapon, they have no incentive to move ahead with serious reductions if we, in effect, unilaterally concede Soviet dominance. To vote down the MX at this critical juncture would send the worst possible message, in my view, to Geneva. The negotiations that began there last week aren't going to be easy. I know hopes are high for them. They're not going to be quick, and they're not going to be easy. We're looking forward to a long, serious, intensive process with some of the toughest bargainers in the world. And these first few weeks and months will set the tone. Will we be negotiating from a position of relative weakness or of strength? And if Congress pulls the rug out from under these negotiators in Geneva, the damage to our hopes for successful talks might be, not saying will be, might be irreversible. Too often in the past, overly hasty U.S. concessions have resulted in flawed and unverifiable arms control treaties. And now, does the Congress want to run that risk again by unilaterally abandoning one of the most important weapons while we're at the bargaining table? Two ideas have been advanced about how to approach the issues of defense and arms negotiations. On the one hand, we could scrap the MX and the B-1 bomber, as some have called for, other vital elements of our modernization program, and simply hope, against experience, that the Soviets will follow suit. That's one course. The other approach, President Reagan's approach, says we'll only get significant reductions when the Soviets see we are serious about correcting the imbalances that have developed in the strategic equation. I believe that the American people decisively reject the first approach and overwhelmingly support the President. They stand behind us when we say the best way to serve our nation and the cause of world peace is to negotiate from strength and not weakness. We should.
When will we have enough nuclear weapons? When will we have enough nuclear weapons? When will we have...
Mr. Vice President, I should note that we're welcoming that last gentleman for the second time to a council meeting. He was last here when Secretary of Defense Weinberger was present 2 years ago. And he has a particular approach and style which we've seen before, and you have as well, I know.
I find it rather compelling. I just don't happen to agree with him. It's an interesting approach. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could expect this kind of lively debate in the Soviet Union, you know, or some other country of that nature, Nicaragua? You know, we all should remember that our allies in Europe showed the courage and the determination, the alliance together, to stick to their alliance, to stick to their commitments to deploy cruise and Pershing missiles, despite relentless Soviet propaganda. For us not to deploy missiles in our own country now could very well weaken their faith in our resolve. It might very well undermine those deployment decisions that are still pending, as well as threaten continued cooperation by those allies who have already moved ahead with initial deployments. The cracks in the unity of the alliance that would surely develop could destroy our credibility in the negotiations we are conducting to reduce INF levels on both sides in Europe. So there is a linkage between the intermediate nuclear force weapons, in my view, and these strategic intercontinental ballistic missiles. It'd be worth taking just a few minutes more before addressing your questions to address the three basic arguments made by the critics of the MX. The first is that they're not survivable. The mistaken logic here is that they are considering MX separately from the other parts of the triad. Each leg complements and reinforces the other two. For the triad to remain survivable and our deterrent credible in the face of ever more challenging Soviet capabilities, we must see that each leg is strengthened and modernized to support the others. We're already well along in strengthening and modernizing our bombers and submarines. It's time we got to strengthening this land-based missile force as well. The second argument is that we should wait, cancel the MX now, and delay modernization of our strategic forces for several more years while we wait for the development of a smaller missile, so-called midget man. But while we argue and dicker and debate, the Soviets have already developed two different kinds of smaller mobile missile systems, as well as the more than 600 MX-class ICBMs that I mentioned before. Do we really think that our negotiators in Geneva, no matter how skillful, no matter how resourceful, will be able to persuade the Soviets to reduce those ICBMs and accept constraints on these two mobile missile systems that exist now in return for our promises to limit one small missile system that exists only on paper and is years away from the deployment? And what leverage will unilaterally terminating the MX program give us in constraining the Soviet systems? The answer is absolutely none. And then the last argument is simply that deploying 100 MXs would destabilize the balance of power. It quickly dissolves, however, that argument when one contrasts those 100 MXs with over 600, as I mentioned, of the MX-type missiles that the Soviets already have sitting in the silos. So it seems to me that stable deterrence is undermined by the current Soviet monopoly of heavy, accurate ICBMs capable of destroying our own missile force. Redressing this imbalance with the MX will only strengthen deterrence. On the MX, the Congress has a clear choice. If it votes no, it will gravely weaken our defense, waste the billions already spent on the program, undercut our allies who have stood firm in accepting the new Pershing and cruise missiles. That was not an easy decision for our allies, and cripple the position of our negotiators in Geneva, and show the Soviets that despite the progress our country has made, at a moment of historic importance, some still lack resolve. In the name of world peace, peace through deterrence, that must not happen. If the Congress votes yes, it will show the Soviets that America today is united and resolute, and that they should get down to serious negotiations, thereby advancing the cause of peace and our children. We are committed to significant arms reductions, agreements that are verifiable. That is the bottom line. That message was taken by me and George Shultz to Moscow. But no vote in recent years has been of greater importance, and I urge you and all citizens to let the Congress know that. When the MX comes to the floor in the next day or two, the American people will be expecting a vote of confidence. The opportunity for a more secure peace really is within our sight. And so I just urge us to grasp that opportunity. Thank you very much, and I'll be glad to respond to your questions.
If the Senate, well, if the Congress approves additional funding for these MX missiles, how are they going to be deployed, and how will they be invulnerable to these silo-busting missiles that the Soviet Union has?
I think the answer is they wouldn't be invulnerable. As I said in my speech, the reason we got, just at the time we were being interrupted, part of the answer to this question of whether they're survivable or not has to be taken into consideration of the triad as a whole. Our existing system, to a degree, has a certain vulnerability. So until we go forward with a mobile missile, there will be some vulnerability, although the silos apparently now have a hardened factor beyond what we had originally thought. We can't argue that they're not going to be suffer loss at all. I can't make that point. But in the context of the triad, I think you have your answer.
Mr. Palta.
Sir, mine is hardly a question, it's a plea for help. In regard to the Strategic Defense Initiative, or what's popularly called the Star Wars, I'm asking as to whether we could reach a stage where we have the capability for SDI, and sooner or later the Russians develop the same. At that particular point, when we have that equality of situation, would there be any technical possibility on the part of either side to develop that degree of technology into offensive weapons rather than defensive?
Well, we hope not, and we believe that, first place, as you know, obviously from this well-informed question, that the SDI is strictly a research program at this time. And for those who aren't as familiar, what the idea would be is to, instead of putting people and populations and humanity at risk, to put weapons at risk, and then at the appropriate time, and it's a long way down the road, and it can be non-nuclear, incidentally, this whole called misnamed Star Wars. It's a defensive system, but share that technology in the hope that you get to the one goal that we now have agreement with the Soviets on, and that is the elimination of these weapons. So I would think that it wouldn't escalate, as they say, into an arms race, into space, but would offer humanity a chance to say, at last, people will not be threatened by nuclear weapons, but the weapons themselves will be at risk.
Thank
And
you, sir.
that's
Thank
the
you very
underlying-
much. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
The middle microphone.
Vice President, it's widely agreed that the main obstacle to an agreement in Geneva is verification. Do you see a viable alternative other than the creation of a U.S.-Soviet commission that would oversee the dismantling of these weapons? Do you see an alternative other than such a commission that would oversee the dismantling and ensure security for both nations at the same time?
Well, on verification, and you're right, it is an enormously important question. I think both sides are going to have to take steps beyond where any of us have trod in terms of verification. I put on the table in Geneva for the President, on behalf of the United States, a couple of years ago, a treaty to ban all chemical warfare. Get rid of it. If the world can't agree on getting rid of chemical weapons, it's going to be very hard to agree on anything in this arms field. And in that treaty, the United States made a proposal for an internationally supervised verification, which would include on-site. It would include the kind of inspection that you're talking about. As you know, heretofore, the Soviet Union has been very reluctant to do much. There's been a step here or there, but in terms of on-site verification. Our appeal in chemical weapons, and then we'll have to wait and see. I don't want to get ahead out of where the negotiators are in this broad field of verification at Geneva today. But our appeal there, and you can use that as a forerunner, was look, here we are in the 1980s. The world is scared to death of the arms race and of the nuclear threat. Let's each go further than we ever dreamed we would have before to permit objective verification. And if you don't trust our people coming there, let's find some international means find a way to internationalize the verification. But I do believe, because there are some examples, regrettably, of failure to comply with the verification and failure to comply with the treaties, that we're going to have to think anew, as Abe Lincoln said. And I think it is going to require, in some areas, and I've cited one, a new look at on-site inspection. And I just think that, let's just hope that everyone around the world will look at it this way, because I think we have to get a treaty that's verifiable. I don't think the Americans, the Senate, would ratify a treaty that was not verifiable. Some of it can be done by highly technological means, as you know.
To talk about China for a moment, if we could. With recent moves in China toward free trade with the West as well as her neighbors in Asia, her recent construction of larger and larger naval combatants and a possible blue water capability as well as nuclear submarines, what is U.S. policy going to be towards China during the next 25 years, or what should it be?
Well, you place it in a long, the question, if you didn't hear it, was U.S. policy towards China, and I guess I heard a concern about the Chinese military. Yeah. We have welcomed the changes in China towards incentive, towards lifting their standard of living through moving away from the highly collectivized communes and the system that was so rigid when I lived over there to more of an opening. They still, in our standards, have a long way to go in terms of human rights. They still have a long way to go in terms of modernization. They still are, as Deng Xiaoping says, a backward country. But they've taken some dramatic steps on the economic side. We see no evidence in what they're doing militarily of a turning outward. You know, the great fear of China during the Chiang Kai-shek in the early days of the Mao Zedong revolution was a China intent on subverting their neighbors. The ASEAN countries, though not totally relaxed, are feeling much more relaxed about China's intentions towards them. China still does support the fraternal brothers, as they say, the communist parties in these countries, and that causes heartburn for Lee Kuan Yew and the others in the ASEAN countries. But really the evidence in terms of the support of revolution, the export of revolution, it doesn't exist except for this fraternal brother thing, and that isn't a militant turning out. So I think we would be concerned if we saw any change in all of that. And we have improved, we think, in spite of some obstacles that continue to exist, our relations with China, and we're encouraging them in this development. The big question that people are asking now is, out of this shift in Moscow, will there be a rapprochement between China and the Soviet Union? And as one who has attended each of these three funerals, I can, and thus participated in and heard the speculation at each place about, does this new man coming in, first Andropov, then Chernenko, and now Gorbachev, does that mean that China and Soviet Union will get back in bed as they were in the Khrushchev days? I would have to say I see no evidence of that. That's a little off your question, but I think it's an important point. And yet they were highly represented, high-level Politburo level representation at the funeral, and I think you'll see a lot of speculation about China moving closer to the Soviets. They may do it, but I don't believe that I see anything in China's makeup, particularly under Deng Xiaoping's leadership, that would go back to a kind of a lockstep Khrushchev era unanimity, you might say.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, we have time for two questions. Your question, sir, and then yours.
All right.
Vice President, I don't suppose you had time to see 60 Minutes last night, where Dan Rather traveled down to Havana and had an interview with Fidel Castro. A couple interesting points in there. I wonder if you could just comment on some of Castro's comments. One, he commented there was no outside Marxist presence in Nicaragua, that it was an internal strife.
If you would, sir, get to the question very quickly.
Okay.
Very little time.
Secondly, he suggested that the U.S. reach out to him a little bit more in the same fashion we reached out to China, even though there's a difference in ideology. If you could comment.
Well, my comments would be that there are positive ways in which Castro could demonstrate a real desire for improved relations. Over the years, there are offensives taken by Castro. Congressman will go down there, a senator will go down there, a visiting delegation will go down there and come back, and he will take a great deal of time to go snorkeling with them and to spend time to send a signal. And it's over and over again. But the problem is the troops still remain in Angola. One of the ways you can really bring independence to Namibia, which we want under Resolution 435 of the UN, is to see those troops come out of Angola. And others criticize our policy, but this would be the quickest and best way to establish an independent Namibia that our administration wants. Castro's troops remain a major stumbling block in terms of South African participation by being right there in Angola. So there are concrete ways that Castro can demonstrate that he is not interested in the export of revolution, and he'll have a go a long way to prove to me, who ran the intelligence community for a while and have evidence to some that he stopped fooling around like that. One good sign, however, it's all not bad, was this recent agreement to take back 24 of those 2,400, I believe, was the figure of the most hardened criminals out of our jails in Atlanta that were dumped out of the asylums and dumped out of the Cuban jails into the American populace. That's a good sign. And in reply, we sat and worked out a kind of normalized some immigration procedure. So I would like to say that, think that someday there would be improved relations, but I really do feel that it's got to be positively, not just talk, but positively demonstrated through the cutting off of support for these radical groups in Colombia and these other Central American countries. Say nothing of the enormous presence of 8,000, not all military, but some advisors in Nicaragua, that he wants to live within his own borders at peace and stop exporting revolution. So we'll keep our antenna up and see whether this is something more than just one more of those kind of periodic offensives. Yes, sir.
Most of your talk has, on this broader conceptual framework of our foreign affairs, is focused on the MX missile. And there are some other voices. And I wondered if most recently your administration has been listening to the bishops who have come out with a statement opposed to the MX missile, and has that been integrated into your broader thinking?
Yes, we think that the church is making a contribution, not just in terms of the debate on the MX, but in terms of debate on human rights in Nicaragua and Salvador and all of this. And we do listen. But as you can tell from my, I'm afraid, far too detailed speech, we don't happen to agree with those that think that this would be destabilizing or escalate the arms race. You see, I'll tell you where we haven't succeeded the way I am convinced in an area where we should. It is only very recently that most of our allies and friends abroad, and I think some of this had to do with the election, understand that our president is very serious about significant arms reductions. And I think there was a great doubt. I think some in our Congress, and we could ask the congressman here or senators, still wonder about that. I think some of those bishops still wonder whether we are really serious about that. I do find amongst our allies in Europe now, and I took our case for INF, either get rid of them all or equal numbers. Remember that zero option? I took that case all over Europe. I do think now our friends in some of the opposition parties, as well as those in power, understand that we are deadly serious. Their hopes are high about the negotiations in Geneva. And yet, how we get there, and we are much closer to them now as to the way we're going about trying to achieve these reductions. I'm not sure, in response to your question, that the bishops, for example, the ones you're talking about, would agree with this approach. But I hope we've laid to rest the canard that we're not interested in arms reduction or this dramatic thing we heard that all we're interested in is building up. We're not. We believe that we can achieve reductions far beyond verifiable, far beyond what anyone else has done. Not a Republican or Democrat, but just the world wants that. We think we're getting on the right track to get there. We think we're realistic in our assessment of the Soviet Union. Not raising Cain with them all the time, but realistic in our assessment. And I cited some of the numbers and what they've been doing in terms of buildup. And so let's all just hope and pray that we are successful in these arms talks. It transcends party, it transcends country. I think the world is crying out for the kind of significant reductions that we're prepared to propose and work for in Geneva. Thank you very, very much.
Mr. Vice President, you're a lightning rod, of course, of a kind, and there's a certain spice, and we have new visitors when someone like the Vice President attends on a higher level. We appreciate very, very much you sharing with us your very earnest and straightforward statement about the MX missile and matters that are of urgent importance to those of us as citizens of the United States. And we appreciate especially you're taking so much of your valuable time after such a busy last 2 weeks to be with us here in Baltimore. We are grateful indeed, Mr. Vice President.